Hey folks, this is JR with DIY Prepper. Welcome to the channel. It really does seem like every time that we turn around, there's some new awful thing happening. Conflicts and tensions in various parts of the world don't seem to be getting any better. Our economy's been struggling for a while. Different biological threats keep cropping up. And then, of course, we have the ongoing political slap fighting. Because of all this, the idea of a large-scale collapse is something that many people, including the super rich, are taking more seriously. Of course, smaller-scale local and regional disasters are still far more likely. And I'm not saying that a collapse is imminent or anything like that, but it is worth taking a look at and thinking about what a total or near total collapse would look like. So today we're going to be talking about the effects that a total collapse would have on our lives and the world. And a situation like that could be caused by several different things, and how exactly it plays out would just depend on its circumstances. If a collapse were caused by something like the global financial system falling apart, or maybe a worse pandemic than we've already faced, then the effects would most likely be gradual. It would be sort of like watching dominoes fall. One thing leads to another, people stop coming to work, maybe they're sick or just simply get laid off, and things start to spiral. Other things like nuclear strikes or an EMP, whether it's man-made or natural, would result in a collapse that happens much faster. Then there's wildcard events like artificial intelligence getting out of hand that could go either way. But regardless of the cause, a collapse would wreak havoc on the infrastructure that makes modern life possible. The most obvious way that we would experience that is through the loss of basic utilities. Power plants require fuel and personnel to operate, and if either of those go missing, they're going to shut down. Even if a power plant runs on a renewable energy source like a hydroelectric plant, people would still be needed to perform basic maintenance on that facility and then also on other parts of that infrastructure like power lines and substations out in the field. So because of that, having the ability to produce your own power would be essential. Gas generators are a good option for short-term situations, but they'll be of limited use in a collapse. Even if you are able to scavenge fuel, gasoline, especially gas that has ethanol in it, it's only going to remain usable for around 6 months without stabilizer. If you have a dual fuel or tri-fuel generator, you may be able to keep it running a little longer. That is, provided you're able to find a substantial source of propane and be able to keep it a secret from others. But if we are in a situation where you're relying on scavenged fuel, it would be best to only run those kinds of generators when you absolutely need to. So an example of that would be if you're trying to use a welder to fabricate something that could help with you or your family's survival. For long-term situations, solar is probably the best option. There are several commercially produced options out there that can provide a lot of power and they're reliable. Or you could go the other route and build your own system. Now, even if you do have a backup power option, you're going to need to make some significant changes to how you use electricity. Portable backup power options probably won't be able to run your entire house long-term the same way that it runs today. So that means you're going to need to make decisions about the devices that you keep going. Things like basic lighting and communication equipment will be priorities for most, but having a more powerful system could allow you to power some larger devices occasionally. But it's important to understand that when power plants start to go down, then other utilities are going to follow pretty quickly. For example, water treatment plants would go offline since they rely on outside power to operate. If you live on ground level, water may last for a few days since there's still some in towers and delivery systems, but if people know that water is going to be in short supply soon, they're going to fill up whatever they can before it's gone, and that's going to deplete that supply faster. If you live in a high-rise building, you're going to lose water sooner since water has to be pumped to higher floors, and that requires electricity. And that's why it's so important to have plenty of water storage and have the ability to procure more as time goes on. Also, having the ability to purify water is essential since natural sources like rivers, creeks, and ponds are probably going to become contaminated since most folks don't know how to deal with their waste properly in the absence of modern plumbing. Another utility that disappears soon after power plants go offline is natural gas. Like with water utilities, natural gas delivery systems rely on power to operate, and without that, they're going to cease to function. So while you may be able to use your gas stove or fireplace if like a tree limb knocks out power to just your neighborhood, this won't be a long-term option if power goes out permanently on a large scale. Another thing that would fail is our communication infrastructure, and that would include both cellular networks and the internet. Even if you are able to keep your cell phone powered up, the towers and other equipment needed for it to do things like make calls and send and receive information won't be operational. So while you may be able to access information stored on the device itself, provided you have some sort of long-term power supply, anything stored on the cloud's going to be inaccessible. Radio communications may still be around, but it'll be on a much smaller scale. While your local FM radio stations would shut down eventually, ham radio would still exist. But when the internet dies, it's going to take modern banking and finance with it. You won't be able to go to the bank and withdraw money, but in all honesty, cash will only have value for so long after a collapse anyway. Failures at power plants and within our communication systems would also cause modern logistics to crumble. Everything from trains to trucks to airplanes would cease to function. All major hubs and ports require electricity to operate, and coordinating things like trains and boats on a large scale would be impossible without modern communication technology. So losing our logistics infrastructure would mean, first of all, no more deliveries to your local grocery store. It also means that gas stations aren't going to be getting any more fuel. And kind of along that same vein, any place that relies on backup generators to operate, they're going to go dark once they run out of diesel. This would mean that hospitals would eventually become abandoned. Without electricity, many pieces of medical equipment would no longer work, and that includes everything from complex life support systems all the way to the refrigerators that keep medications cool. Since there wouldn't be any more deliveries, things like bandages and medications would eventually run out, and when you combine that with the fact that many medications, especially antibiotics, are produced overseas, the situation only gets worse. Another thing that'd be affected during a collapse is our food supply, and that would go far beyond just the delivery problems that I mentioned a second ago. Our current population would be unsustainable without modern farming techniques. Without fuel, the equipment that does everything from till the ground to harvest produce wouldn't work. In addition, over half of the world's population now lives in urban areas, and that's going to only continue to grow as time goes on. Major cities lack natural resources and would quickly become unsustainable. Fortunately, the ways that you can prepare for this are pretty simple. Storing dry goods like beans and rice is the cheapest way to store large quantities of food, but doing this requires quite a bit of water to prepare that food. Commercially canned goods have a long shelf life and they're a little bit easier to prepare. However, as with water, having food storage is just one part of the equation. You're also going to need a way to grow and obtain additional food as time goes on. Gardening is a good option, and it's a skill you can start learning now even if you don't have a ton of space. Raising animals is another thing you can do, and having small things like rabbits and chickens is becoming more common and widely accepted even in many urban and suburban areas. Food preservation skills like canning are also important, since running a refrigerator would require a very substantial long-term power supply. Another thing that would disappear during a collapse is our financial system, and that would be true even if the collapse isn't caused by the economy itself. 2020 was a perfect example of how a thriving economy can be cut down by something completely unexpected. Also, everything from mismanagement at the highest levels all the way to a lack of confidence among investors and even consumers can cause issues, and when problems start to happen, they tend to compound on each other and make the situation a lot worse. If there were to be a total collapse, modern forms of currency would eventually become worthless. When people realize that the system is gone and how hungry they are, they're not going to care how many $100 bills you start to throw at them. And over time, barter and trade would probably replace the monetary systems that we use today. It would start off small, like with neighbors trading a bottle of water for a can of green beans, but then it would probably grow beyond that, and it would also include trading skills. So that's another reason why it's important to learn things that would be useful, that you could trade with other people to get stuff that you need. But places like fairgrounds and farmers markets could become the new primary places of commerce for those who survived the initial stages of a collapse. These kinds of places would also be natural hubs for trade between communities. Although a replacement economy would likely happen eventually, the opening stages of a collapse are going to be marked by confusion, fear, and lawlessness. And that's something that we've seen time and time again in areas that have been affected by natural disasters as well as large-scale economic hardship. And while all cities and communities would suffer, not every place would look the same. Areas that already suffer from extensive crime would only become worse. Other areas that have relatively low crime now would see dramatic increases in that, but I don't think it would reach the same extremes as it would in areas that already tolerate that sort of thing. So my personal opinion is that the period of lawlessness will last as long, basically, as people will put up with it. But regardless of where you are, there probably will be a time where you are going to be on your own. So during that time, you need to be able to defend yourself and your loved ones. And that may look different depending on where you live. But my advice is to have the most effective means of defense that you possibly can. So take where I live in Texas, for example. I have a lot of leeway with the firearms that I can own, and I definitely take advantage of that. But if you live in other states and especially other countries, you may not have that. So get the best that you possibly can to give you the biggest advantage possible. But in addition to weapons, also have other tools like alarms for your doors and windows. You can pick up these small battery-operated magnetic door and window alarms pretty cheap locally and online. Early warning systems like motion sensors are good as well, along with physical security devices like fences, locks, and chains. And while those kinds of things may not totally stop somebody from entering your home or your property, they will be able to slow them down, and it'll force them to make a lot more noise getting to you, so that'll give you more reaction time and rob them of the element of surprise. And while some people will band together to take the things that they need from others, on the other side of things, people will also band together to protect what they have and their community. In some areas, existing leaders like sheriffs may take on new leadership roles. And folks like this may be a natural fit for that kind of position, since folks already look to them as leaders anyway, and we all know that people with power and authority usually don't give that up too easily. However, that being said, it is very likely that many emergency workers, including police and firefighters, will stop showing up to work so that they can better protect their families, especially in the opening stages of a collapse. But even after time passes and things start to settle down, law and order will probably look very different then than it does today. Nowadays, you commit a crime, you might sit in jail waiting for months for a sentence. But in that situation, justice is going to probably be much more quick, and it's going to be more brutal than it is now. So if you get caught stealing, I would not expect to sit in jail for 6 months receiving 3 meals a day. Now, when it comes to leadership on a national level, there's a good chance that it will survive to some extent, even if it's just to preserve the people within it. The US, for example, has a very detailed continuity government plan that'll ensure that some sort of central leadership remains, even if they're just surviving being holed up in a mountain. But even if the people that make up governments do survive, their ability to administer government's probably going to be greatly diminished, because like with other things, running a government requires people, it requires resources, and without those things, it's not going to be able to run. So power from a practical standpoint is going to probably become more localized. We might return more towards a city-state type of government, and laws and things like that are going to be determined and enforced locally. But as far as how long it'll take for things to return to normal, no one really knows for sure. However, if a total collapse were to occur, the way of life that we know now, where everything is connected globally, may never return. And also, after the initial chaos is over, the people who survive all of that and they start a new life for themselves, they begin building new things, they and their children may actually prefer their new way of life versus the old. And history has proven over and over that when one thing ends, something else will eventually take its place. But at the end of the day, humans are social creatures. While individual survival may take precedence in the opening stages of a collapse, over time, some sort of society's probably going to develop. Now, if you want to see what survival would look like in an urban environment, be sure to check out this video. And if you want to see items that maybe you should be stockpiling in 2023 in case something goes down, check out this video. Thank y'all for stopping by. Y'all have a good one.